you know. However, I do claim that space is actually about everything. And I'm going to explain how and in what ways, but the simple way to defend this position that space is about everything, whatever experience you think about, like including dreams, mythologies we have, imaginations of other worlds and so on, they are always spatial. And that we sometimes forget or take it for granted. And because we take it for granted, and because we have taken spatiality for granted for so long, we don't have spatial literacy. So there you go. That's the first reason why you should read my book. It's about raising literacy, spatial literacy. But then, why did I choose this topic? Well, for me, of course, it's personal. Everything is personal in a sense. For me, space has been kind of something that I, on the personal level, actually, I've been searching for most of my life. In the sense, I'm talking about home, searching for home, but I don't mean to sound poetic or anything, please, because actually nothing about it is poetic. When you're homeless, globally, there is nothing poetic about it. Maybe reading about it could be poetic, but it's not poetic. What I mean is something more political, searching for space. So or the space of home, the space of intimacy, or what I call oratic space. And now later I'm going to come to the word oratic and why oratic. So to me, it was always a question that in some spaces you just don't feel at home. You lose certain skills, like speaking well, listening well, daydreaming well. You just lose those abilities. And in other spaces, you can have, quote unquote, a more artistic, a more aesthetic form of life, a more beautiful life, whatever that means to you as an individual. But as an individual, and that's the whole story, it's about your individual oratic experience, because oratic experience, by definition, is individual, is about you. So the codes have to do with your history, your childhood, your psychology, and so on and so forth, your taste, and so on and so forth. But certain spaces completely alienate. In other words, in some spaces we just feel alienated. We feel out of space, if you will. You feel we are kind of a wound in that place. We are something to be gotten rid of. Whereas in other spaces, it's easier to forget about yourself, to be less aware of your bodily existence as an addition to that space. So if you are a minority member, I claim women, refugees, you know what I talk about. It's a daily experience when you are, when you become the subject of the gaze of the other. That alienating, violent, I would even call it fascistic gaze that turns you to just something, an addition or a mistake in that place. You're supposed to be somewhere else, or you're supposed to be something as opposed to a subject. So the gaze that deprives you of subjectivity, of personhood, of the right to daydream, all that. So that alienating space, I claim there's a history and there's a mechanism. There's a mechanism behind making space alienating. And that is all political. Now, the problem is, when we think about history, and this has been claimed by others also, history, we think about it, you know, you need a theory, it's complicated, it's dialectical. Nobody would equate between time and history, of course. But for some reason, we think space is just linear, simple, easy to experience, and we don't even have another word for that other space, the dialectical, like time, history, space, what? maybe spatiality. And because of that, I think we don't even have, as I said, we don't have the literacy to articulate our spatial experiences. And that's a big problem, I think, because then everything we do is spatial. Whatever experience we have is always necessarily spatial, including our dreams. Okay, so that's why the book starts by, well, first, dealing with the word totalitarian, because it's very problematic. It has a history in politics, Cold War, and all that. So I claim, by relying on others, of course, especially the Frankfurt School thinkers, I claim that totalitarianism doesn't have to be a terroristic political system of, of the police and all that. It could be also just any form of unlimited exercise of power, however you reach that, however the regime reaches that. In fact, in the conclusion of the first chapter, I claim that perfect, advanced, or new totalitarianism doesn't even need the police traditional police apparatuses. It reaches a point where we police ourselves, and that's perfect totalitarianism. Then I move to, of course, the key word, space, how space is produced, because that's the first thing we need to understand, that space is a production. And the first one who did that, who came up with a theory for that, is Henry Lefebvre, the French thinker who wrote many books, over 60, 70, I guess, but one of them is called The Production of Space, a very important book, a very dry, hard read, and so on. So I try really in that chapter to make it a little bit more accessible, but if you get too bored, just jump to the next chapter, that's fine. But the idea there is this: the space is produced. And he comes up with a theory of three layers: practice, perceive, how we perceive space, how we conceive space. And he has all these concepts, very abstract and so on. I'm not going to talk about that, but the idea is that imagine just this space, if we change our practices, it's going to change. If we challenge the designers of the space, if we challenge the bureaucrats who decided, who designated certain tasks for this space, it's going to change. On the other hand, if we submit to those rules anywhere we are, think about, say, a city square, a public square, city square, that could be a space for consumption, a space for submission, but also a space for protest that could actually change many other spaces we experience on daily levels. So that's the easiest way to go about that. I give some examples from around the world, but also occupy the whole experiment of the Occupy and its significance and its failures and so on. And then I move to, okay, that's Lefebvre. Well, what Lefebvre doesn't do is the technologies of power in space. And that's where we need Foucault. So I bring in Foucault. A lot of people have talked about the panopticon, that design, that architectural design, but it's really more formula. So I talk about panopticism and its principles, what it means. So it's a technology for the gaze. It's a technology, a utilitarian technology that maximizes the effects, the power effects of the gaze, and subjugates the maximum number of people for the purpose of discipline. So the idea is that to be aware of the fact that you might be watched. So how could you do that? Because the government is always a non-democratic entity, because it's a minority by definition, as Rancière would say, for example. So it's always a non-democratic entity. Then it's really impossible to have the human resources to have everyone watched. Then you need a technology, and that's panopticism. It comes up with the Enlightenment, of course, with Bentham. So Foucault problematizes that. he says, in order to understand modernism, we really have to understand panopticism. So then I claim even the technologies of surveillance today, really in terms of principles, it relies on panopticism. Just maximizing that awareness of in people that you're being watched. And that will change your behavior automatically. And of course, okay, let me stop there. I will move to the other chapters. But there's a lot of debate about surveillance. So what? I've been watched. If I do nothing, if I don't have anything to hide, so what? Well, then I claim, well, if you are at that point, you already accept being punished for a crime you haven't done. Because the idea of being an inmate in the panopticon is that you don't have anything to hide. But guess what? As a citizen, as a human being, you are entitled to things to hide. And that doesn't mean crimes. But thinking in terms of like administrative totalitarianism, then you only think in terms of whether an act is a crime or not. So that's the problem, and a whole bunch of other arguments, but I give some examples, movies, novels, and all that. I do my best, so I'm not trying really to sell you the book. I know it's expensive. But then I move to the other central, the most central, I'd argue, a concept, that's aura. So the argument goes as follows. So in totalitarian space, something is missing. You create totalitarian space, but you destroy something in order to do that. What is that something? And I think still, that I found out something. Well, of course, this is theory. So I have to name it, and I have to create the concept. I borrow the concept from Benjamin, and that is aura. So I need a negative concept, and that perfect negative concept was aura, so I borrow aura, but then I follow the traces of Walter Benjamin, what he did, how he talked about aura, and then what is missing. So I claim under totalitarianism, aura is missing. Benjamin doesn't talk about spatial aura, so that's my work. I try to say space too has aura. Most of the times where Benjamin talks about places where Benjamin talks about aura, it's about aura of works of art. So I talk about aura of space and what that means, and how that is destroyed through culture industry, through standardization, and so on and so forth, commodification, and so on and so forth. So those are two chapters about aura, perhaps the most central in the book. And then I move to actual examples, how, for example, mechanically reproduced images destroy the aura of space, and that affects our spatial experience. So at the end, so I sent this, SUNY, where is SUNY? SUNY disappeared. Yeah, so they said two very nice reviewers, great, they said all these nice things about it, but they said, what is the alternative? I thought, okay, now this is always the question. I wrote a paper about, no, in order to criticize any system, you don't necessarily need to have an alternative. But that's still a good question because it pushed me to think about, okay, what is the alternative? And so that's why, in fact, you can start from the conclusion. Maybe you should do that because it's kind of more polemic and all that. It's more myself, you know. Good friends who know me tell me for talks like this, please don't be yourself. But at the end, that's myself, I'm being myself, and so on. So what I do is this. Like, really, before you ask about the alternative, you first need to know the scope. Imagine the scope of the crisis. Without knowing that, the question of alternative is just to end the debate, end the conversation. So we live in totalitarian spaces, and because of that, we cannot even imagine what it is like to live in an auratic space. Now, one of the questions is, oh, what about art? Because that's cool talk, you know, art, you know, have art everywhere. And no, look, fascism was never short of works of art. You can have a city full of works of art, but still a miserable, alienated, everyday experience of space. So there I make the argument that, in fact, art is the result of alienation. we do art precisely because we don't have a beautiful life. So you're miserable, you look for something, some others, you create some other thing, some other impossibility, and that's art. I'm talking even about great works of art. So art is not the solution. Art is just a reflection of the problem, or as Deleuze would say, it's the illusion. You create an illusion, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just for you. You're not forcing it on anyone. You are not forcing even any rituals on anyone. You know, when you come see my work of art, you have to, I don't know, wear black or whatnot, or put a hat or don't put a hat, or it's just art. It's just madness. On that level, it's an illusion, but it could be a protest. A protest against what? Serious art. It could be a protest precisely against this alienated totalitarian space. And therefore, it's an evidence that we live in totalitarian space. We are alienated, as opposed to it's a solution. No, it's not a solution. So then I come up with something else, going back to the beginning of the book, what is the alternative in terms of political action? So I claim that we have the body of the condemned, that is a space that carries all the traces of oppression. You have that space, you politicize it, you put it against the highest level of symbolic space or sacred space. And then you have fascinating forms of undoing or the destruction of the totalitarian space. And I give some examples there, like actual examples, such as Pussy Riot, what they do with the body, with the space, and so on, and why that is actually a revolutionary movement. And then I end up with an argument about hope, and where is hope, and how can we talk about hope, and how if you don't position yourself in a situation of the hopeless ones, it's absurd to talk about hope, because hope is a product, in a way, of hopelessness. So unless you actually experience the hopelessness, there's no point of talking about hope. And that's my dialectics of hope. And let's just stop there. For now, I will try to answer your questions if you have any. And I will try to avoid the common piece of advice, oh, for that question, go read my book. I won't do that. I think that's a little cheap. Please.
I always struggle with this idea of how do you address the individual within the space versus sort of the notion of solidarity. How important is it to your way of thinking through aura and space as the individual, or how a group of people are gazed at, or how they're treated or categorized? So the individual versus, I like to think in terms of movements and social solidarity. Can you put that a little bit into context?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, but in a sense, in the negative sense. In the beginning of the book, I talk about how without the isolation, individuation of the individuals, in other words, breaking those organic ties we have with each other, without breaking that, and that's perfectly done under capitalism and other oppressive systems for that matter. Without that, totalitarianism itself is not possible. Because first you have, even in panopticism, the technology of the panopticon, the idea is it's designed that way, to actually isolate each individual. So the individuals in the cells, they can't even communicate with each other because there's the wall. But at the same time, everyone is completely visible, so the space is completely transparent. But the individuals are kind of individuated, isolated. Without that, it's impossible for any minority, any oligarchy, which is the government, or the ruling group, or the state apparatuses, to actually control any population, because always the population is more powerful in principle. So absolutely, and I think without, you see, that's the problem of fetishism of commodities, because the more alienated we are, the more powerless we become, and we, of course, what do? We all keep thinking that happiness is just one purchase away. One more commodity, then I'll be fine. One more piece for entertainment and so on, as opposed to talking, just doing the talk, whatever it is, and rebuilding those connections, a form of solidarity and so on. Unfortunately, though, the properties that we have, the very idea of private property and division of labor and so on, keeps isolating us even more, so they become like our cages. We have, so I'll stop there, but I hope I answered your question. Please.
So I agree with you that we need a kind of spatial literacy in politics, but I guess I have two questions, and obviously I'll have to read the book. But your concept of totalitarian space, obviously, you read through Foucault, is not just about a state apparatus, but also about the ways in which we give over a sense of alienation in terms of media companies or social media or all of the privacy we might give up, for scrutiny that we just, check the box. Yes, I agree to this. So I'm wondering, in terms of how far field totalitarian space is from something that Hannah Arendt would define in terms of totalitarianism as in the sense of total terror, when you lose not only the ability to work with others, but you lose that conversation with yourself. And that was for her what was so novel about that form of government. So I'm wondering, it's a bold move to use that. So I wonder if you might use the film that you mentioned. I don't know what film it is, to help explicate that.
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of examples in terms of cinema and so on. But here's the idea. Yes, the conclusion for what Arendt says, yeah, absolutely. It's that breaking the individual, so to speak. But the disagreement, and this has, as you know, this critique has existed since Frankfurt School, Marcuse especially. So the disagreement is that it doesn't have to be governmental and terror and all that. In fact, even sometimes in the book, like you can sense that Hannah Arendt knows that, yes, when totalitarianism is perfect, it doesn't need the police. But now it's even more nuanced, more complicated, because it's that coalition, that perfect coalition. It's not a conspiracy that a bunch of evil people in the government, as you know, decide that let's make the lives of these people miserable also, even on the level of corporations or so on. So no, absolutely, it's not a moral question on that level, as you know. And there also I'm more of a Foucauldian. So you enter, for example, you go to now Starbucks is learning the game. So they try to create an experience of authenticity, whatever that means. It's like, a creative way of imitation that doesn't look like imitation, that doesn't look like mass production. So it kind of comes up with creative ideas, so the space would be a little different. But it used to be, and it is still, once you are aware of those tricks, you enter any Starbucks or any, say, you give me an example, I don't know, Walmart store or anything, whether it's Vancouver, whether it's Seattle or New York or Albany, the experience is exactly the same, and it's meant to be that way. Because for us, the goal is to be able, in the easiest, fastest way, the commodity we need. Sometimes it's easier to go to the store and buy another piece than find it in your mess of your commodities at home, because cheaper. So it is meant to be that way, and we are kind of addicted to that. So even when we travel, like I live in Canada, but when I came, like first time I remember when I came to Buffalo, I was looking for Tim Hortons. I don't know if you know Tim Hortons. It's like the Canadian. So where's Tim Hortons? Because I have to have my breakfast there when I travel and so on. So that's exactly, it's the, Adorno calls it like the child who wants the same dish over and over again. So we are spatially actually kind of become also so powerless that we become subjects of a totalitarian world, you know? I think I didn't answer your question.
No, that's helpful. So then in terms of like the question of political action that you mentioned, and I don't know, I mean, at least from the talk, you seem a wee bit torn between a bit of a Foucauldian answer and a bit more of the Benjaminian messianism, but perhaps I've misread that.
No, Benjamin.
In terms of where you are in terms of questions of political action. I mean, obviously, if you're retaining something of the dialectic.
Actually, the only, perhaps, if I had one problem with Benjamin, it's precisely his messianic.
I would be curious about that.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But otherwise, absolutely, I mean, the problems come out later with the idea of aura, because first he, you know, as you know, he has a problem with the destruction of aura, then he celebrates that. So that's where my problem comes in, and Adorno had that fight with Benjamin in the letters and all that. But in terms of political action, my position at the end of the book is that we have to get rid of that idea that first we need a theory of revolution, then we go out and we'll have the revolution. That was the 20th century, and it was a miserable failure, because it reproduces the division of labor, that some people have to think the revolution, some people have to do it. I think no. It's something that has to be realized through immediate, imminent negation on everyday level. So we need to start negating together. As we do that, we also realize bits and pieces of the possibility of that other horizon. So it's a more of a horizon of possibilities that I mean, so you don't, my example with a city full of works of art, that is not going to bring back auratic experience. Because there's no beautiful space without beautiful life. That's basically my conclusion. We first have to have the complete awareness of the crisis, then we can perhaps tell what is missing, and through going back to some form of, I don't know, some form of whatever. I mean, obviously, I don't call for any return to the state of nature or any time in history. That's not desirable, that's not feasible, and that's actually a scary thing. You know, fascists sometimes do that, or even thinkers like Heidegger and so on sometimes were crazy about that, and we know the results. But I think it's possible to create a horizon of possibilities that we shouldn't even predict. We shouldn't force prediction on it, but yes, through that kind of some form of togetherness without even romanticizing that kind of body of collectivity, because as you know, that's also potentially dangerous. Because, you know, because in the, you know, the problem with some of the new voice or new ageism and so on get together, what do they call it, like the positive energy crossing arms. I think that's very problematic. In fact, it's disgusting, because the person beside you could be a fascist. I don't want to do that. First, we need to talk. First, we need to have an honest fight over everything, and then forms of political action will be born out of that, as opposed to let's be good, let's be full of love, and let's go 1 week to India and learn, you know, how to reach nirvana, that kind of nonsense, yeah? Any other questions, comments? Okay, so then, yeah, that.
So, for those of us who are philosophically challenged, could you clarify what you mean by the concept of aura? So I'm not overly familiar with that. Maybe there's some others in here who aren't as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, in the beginning, when I start the book, I say I'm not going to use aura until I promise until I really clarify it very well. So I would not use it in a definitive way and so on. But the beginning, so, and then in the chapter where I deal with aura, I deal with actually a little bit of its history and how Benjamin used it, and a little bit of misconceptions and so on. But like generally, this would be sufficient to think about it as just the uniqueness of an experience, that negative, intangible thing that could be. Then I have a whole bunch of possible definitions. Aura, for example, as trace. So, like imagine a tool has been used for tens of years. So the trace on that tool just makes it so unique, so beautiful, so part of one's life, as opposed to something shiny, glassy, miserable, like alienating and so on. So aura as trace, aura as runes. You go to runes of a place, like once in Turkey I went to, in Diyarbakir I went to the ruins of an Armenian house. And you could, the experience was just literally overwhelming. Now, of course, I had to be careful. I had to respect, this is tragedy, still alive. You can't deal with it as with the stupidity of a tourist. But just the experience of the space itself, being aware of that, like the runes. So then the fear is, in that sense, when even the runes are not there, then that's completely non-auratic. So as runes, then so in that sense also as nostalgia, so I claim that Gustav Bachelard, for example, whenever he talks about this poetic space, which is home, it turns out to be, of course, the space of childhood. So we need that space, it seems, that distance. And so then I talk about aura as distance. So there's this great poet who says, between my gaze or my eye and the window, there's a distance. How come I haven't noticed that? So I think it's being aware of that distance also. So or Adorno calls it in a letter to Benjamin, the presence of the absence, so aura then as absence. So absence not as emptiness, but absence as that, as being aware of a presence in some other way. And once we don't have that, that's also non-auratic, that's also totalitarian. Like think about the people being born into a totalitarian world where surveillance is normalized. Then the fear is that. So we are both unfree, but the difference is that I can articulate my unfreedom, at least. And that's still auratic in some level. But being unfree and not being able to articulate one's unfreedom, or even worse, being unfree and thinking that you're free, and then that's completely hopeless. So, and that's us, I think, in some ways. Yeah, thank you very much for coming.